Okay, so the project for today is to replace the fuel filter at the carburetor. And we have the original Quadrajet carburetor, and so it has this little in carburetor fuel filter. So it looks like this kind of guy. And there are apparently two, well, there's lots of part numbers depending on the brand, but what I have here is a Wix, and based on my research, I think there are two part numbers. This one is the 33052. There's also a 33048. And according to the parts interchange information, either of those is fine. I looked at both of them. They look to be almost identical, except the gasket or this little hole on the end here seems to be a little bit different. So because they seem to both be listed, I think either one would be fine. I'm going to use the 52 because that's what I have. We haven't been having any problems. The coach has been running pretty well, but it's getting into springtime and I'm starting to do some just annual maintenance type things. And so I think I'll just replace the fuel filter because I think it's a good thing to do periodically, especially since this is such a small fuel filter and there's lots of reports of it getting plugged up and causing problems. So I think it's good to replace it once a year regardless, and then I have a couple of extras if something happens while we're driving. We can swap it out if we need to. But it should be a pretty easy repair, and it's located at the front of the carburetor down here. So the first thing to do is take off the air filter housing, and we'll get to this. It's pretty cold today, and so I want to be a little bit careful not to break any rubber lines or anything that might be kind of cold and hard. All right, so it's very easy to see here, just right on the front of the carburetor. We have an insulated fuel line coming into it, and so that's I think an upgrade to help prevent vapor lock. I've read kind of mixed reports on how much it helps or not, but we haven't had any problems, so it must be okay. I'm going to use a line wrench, and so these are basically a special wrench with a small gap to fit onto this fitting here and give you a tight fit. It appears to be a 5/8 inch wrench and should be able to just break this loose. Oh, okay. So I'm turning the whole housing here, and the housing is a 1 inch, and so I'm going to hold that so that I can break loose just the fitting. There we go. And I see that there is some thread tape on these. I don't think that's common, so I'm going to need to do a little bit of research and find out if you're supposed to have thread tape on these or not. So a little bit of fuel leaking out, not a big deal. That should evaporate pretty quick, so it shouldn't cause any kind of problem. I'll make sure all of that's gone before I start it up. I don't want to have a risk of a fire. And then now that I've got that fitting off, I can loosen this. And I think that there is a spring in here, so I'm guessing you need to be a little careful as you take this off so that things don't spring around or shoot off and get lost. So I see some thread tape on this also, which is, I think, probably not necessary and maybe not a good idea. But I'll do a little research on that and provide some ideas there. Yep, there is a spring in there, and it just fell out down into the bottom. And there's a fair bit of fuel in here. I think I'm going to get a rag and wipe this up just so that it doesn't all have to evaporate. Looking at the filter here, I don't see a bunch of gunk, but I think the way it's oriented, the fuel goes in the end, and then any gunk and stuff would actually be caught inside. I don't really see much in there, so Looks like it's in pretty good shape. That's good. It means that my fuel tanks are probably not too rusty. But I'm going to get a rag, clean this up a little bit, and then we'll get ready to put in the new filter. All right, so I did a little bit of internet searching, and pretty much everything I saw said don't use Teflon tape on your fuel line fittings. And so I found that there is a little gasket that fits on this end right here. So I'm glad I didn't lose that. I remember now seeing it in some of the pictures. And it looks like it's in good shape. It's not cracked or anything, so that's good. And then I cleaned up the threads here, but on this end, where this other fitting is, it's a fitting connection here, and so that should be tight. And some of what I read was that apparently the white Teflon tape can be dissolved by gas, and so putting it together and you get some gas on it can dissolve. You can get pieces that go in and plug up your filter, so generally not good. When I put this all together, I'm going to have to really be careful and make sure it doesn't leak, because maybe the tape was there to prevent a leak or a problem, and so I'll have to carefully check that. Some of the things I saw said that if there is a leak, you should replace the parts to fix it, but in an emergency you could use yellow Teflon tape, which is the type that's designed for gas lines. I have some of that for the liquid propane gas lines that I've done some work on. But I'm going to clean all this up. I'm going to try to assemble it without any tape and then check it carefully for leaks. Okay, so cleaned up the threads. Now it's time to put things back together. This rubber gasket goes in first, and then we'll use the spring. We need to put this little plastic, it's probably some kind of nylon gasket, on here. And it looks like it kind of snaps on. Maybe I need to do that before I put the filter in. Okay, yeah, there we go. It kind of just slides on there pretty tight. And I'm guessing this probably normally wouldn't come off if you are taking it apart kind of carefully, but because I had to get that Teflon tape off, this came off. And I'm looking here, and it looks like if I'm not careful, it could kind of pinch, and so I'm making sure I've got it all the way on the lip, all the way around there. And then rubber side goes in first, and then the spring, and the spring looks uniform. I don't see that it would go one way or the other. And then put this back into the carburetor, and it's hard to see here, but I don't see anything that looks like a particular hole or anything that the filter or spring needs to go into. So I'm just making sure it's centered and seems to have about the right amount of tension. And then I will just thread it in. And I'm doing this by hand because I want to make sure it doesn't cross thread or anything. All right. And I recall when I was taking this apart that it was threaded in almost all the way into the carburetor. So let's get it all the way in. That looks pretty good. And now I'll just snug this up a little bit. Kind of hard to get a wrench on this. I think I might actually try to use the closed end here just to get a good grip on it. This is a little bit mangled up, so the wrench doesn't go on very nicely. I have to put this on my list of things to replace. I saw that there was a replacement housing for the fuel filter. And all right, yep, that feels pretty tight. And then we'll put the fuel line back on. Same thing, make sure I get it started by hand and thread it in. And then I'll use this 5/8 line wrench again to tighten it down. And I think just need this to be snug. You want to not twist or break anything. So I think that looks okay. So now I want to do a careful leak check, throw away the old filter, and maybe take it for a drive. All right, so we started it up and we did a leak test, and unfortunately there were some drips, and so don't want to have any kind of fuel leak whatsoever. So I checked, everything was tight. I couldn't really tighten it down anymore. And it was still had a slow drip coming off of the fuel line where it goes into that filter housing. And so I got some yellow tape, so for gas line type of tape, and put it on there. I made sure it was back a little bit from the end of the threads, just to make sure there wasn't going to be any pieces of tape or anything that could get pulled into the filter. And then reinstalled it, and now I'm not getting any drips. I don't really like the idea of having tape on that, and so I think I probably will get a new fitting, not a fitting, but the housing for the fuel filter. This one looks pretty old, and then maybe there's something wrong with the threads or something like that, and so, or the seat where the line goes into it. And so I'm going to do that just to be safe, but after running it for quite a while, I was not getting any drips with that tape on the fuel line. And so I think for now it's okay, but I'm going to do a little more work later to replace that housing and make sure that I can make it not leak even without any tape on the threads. All right, so when we were working on replacing the fuel filter, we had a problem with the fuel line leaking, and I put a little bit of gas line Teflon tape on the fitting, which stopped the leak, but I didn't really like that. I really would like not to have anything on those fittings. And so I got a new housing for the fuel filter. So the fuel filter goes in there. It comes with a new little nylon seal, and the fuel line screws into this. And so the fuel line is relatively new. It's an insulated aftermarket line. We can go down here and take a look at it. So this is a replacement fuel line going in. This is where I put the tape to stop the leak. And then this is the replacement fuel filter housing. And so we just replaced the fuel filter. We haven't driven it, but because I was getting a leak here, I put the tape on to prevent the leak. And I just decided I didn't like that. I wanted to just replace all this. So that's what I'm going to do now. Put it back together and make sure it doesn't leak. All right, so we ran it for a while. You can see the choke is open, and the new fuel filter housing is in. I tightened this down. I took off the Teflon tape that I had here and ran it for a while, and no leaks, nice and dry. And so not having to put tape on the threads anymore, and it's not leaking. So that's what I wanted to see. So I think my original simple fuel filter replacement, which turned into extra things, has now been successful, and hopefully won't give me any trouble in the future when I need to do a fuel filter again.